Early March 1943. Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. The wrench tumbled from oil-darkened fingers as Captain Paul Irvin Gun stared at the altered bomber parked before him. Inside that plane lay something that had no business existing. A blatant breach of every Army Air Force's regulation, and something his superior had never formally approved. 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns jutted where the bombardier's glass nose ought to have been. The B-25 Mitchell, built for precise high-altitude bombing, had been converted into a radically different weapon, a ship killer, a commerce raider, an illicit experiment that might either rescue the Pacific Campaign or send Gun to a What no one realized then was that this unauthorized alteration, born of desperation and private rage, would set in motion the single most crushing naval defeat Japan would suffer in the Pacific War. The arithmetic of Allied success in the Southwest Pacific was being shaped not in approved operations rooms in Washington, but in welding bays and maintenance sheds by a 43-year-old iconoclast waging his own vendetta. The road to that moment had begun 2 years earlier on December 8, 1941. Manila time. Paul Irvin Gun, to nobody yet as Papy, stood at Nichols Field watching Japanese bombers methodically shred the American air presence in the Philippines. As manager of the fledgling Philippine Airlines, he commanded for Red Beach 18 civilian planes. Within hours, Major General Louis Brereton would seize those aircraft and commission Gun a captain in the Army Air Forces. What was meant to be a short wartime stint became a 3-year campaign of improvisation, retribution, and technological upheaval. Gun was 42. A former Navy Chief Petty Officer who had spent 2 decades as an enlisted naval aviator before retiring in December 1939. He learned to fly in the 1920s, served with the famed Top Hatters fighter squadron, and taught at Pensacola. He knew airplanes not from manuals but from 20 years of building, flying, and sometimes crashing them. But on that December morning, technical skill mattered less than an immediate, agonizing choice. His wife, Clara Louise, called Polly by everyone, and their 4 children were trapped in Manila as Japanese forces closed in. His sons, Paul Jr. and Nathan, were teenagers. Daughters Connie and Julie were younger. Their comfortable expatriate life had vanished overnight. In the chaotic weeks that followed, Gun flew reconnaissance and transport missions across collapsing Philippine defenses, dodging Japanese fighters, surviving a shoot-down in the jungle, walking out to safety, and climbing into another aircraft without pause. On one run, he earned a Distinguished Flying Cross by piloting an unarmed transport into Baton to deliver medicine to besieged American troops, threading Japanese-controlled skies with sheer nerve. But he could not reach his family. On Christmas Eve 1941, he received orders to evacuate key personnel to Australia. He gathered every cent of his military pay, borrowed what he could from colleagues, and prepared to take his family out. The Japanese advance moved too fast. They never reached the airfield. Faced with the choice to defy orders or depart without them, he obeyed because orders mattered, because the war was larger than one household, because staying meant capture or death. Within weeks, on January 20th, 1942, Polly and the children were rounded up by Japanese forces and interned at the University of Santo Tomas, converted into a camp for enemy civilians. When Gun heard the news, something inside him cracked. The man who kept fighting was not the same person who had left Manila. He had abandoned his wife and children to an enemy with a brutal reputation. Every day they remained in that camp was a day he could not shield them. The only course he could see was to end the war sooner, if he could not rescue them directly. He would target every ship, aircraft, and supply line sustaining Japanese forces in the Philippines. This was not official doctrine. It was personal vengeance masquerading as innovation. When Major General George C. Kenney arrived in Brisbane in late July 1942 to take command of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, he found a calamity. His predecessor had been removed, morale was shattered, equipment was inadequate, and the Japanese dominated the skies over New Guinea, threatening Australia itself. General Douglas MacArthur, the theater commander, had little faith in his air arm and made that clear. Kenney, 53, a World War I fighter ace with 2 confirmed victories and a Silver Star, had taught at the Air Corps Tactical School and was known for unconventional thinking. After enduring an hour-long denunciation from MacArthur about Allied air shortcomings, Kenney calmly asked for one thing: authority to send home anyone he deemed deadwood. MacArthur, taken aback, agreed. Within weeks, Kenney reshaped his staff, bringing in aggressive younger officers and establishing a forward headquarters in New Guinea. 2 speed decisions: he named Brigadier General Innes Whitehead as his forward commander and empowered him to reassign aircraft based on weather and tactical needs instead of waiting for Brisbane. But personnel moves were useless without weapons that worked. Medium and high-altitude bombing was failing to stop Japanese ships. High-altitude attacks gave targets too much time to evade. B-17 flying fortresses were scoring on fewer than 1% of their aims. Japanese convoys resupplied garrisons in New Guinea with impunity, while Allied ground forces bled in the jungle as reinforcements disembarked from ships bombers could not sink. Kenny had been wrestling with this problem since 1928 at the tactical school, where he had conceived skip bombing, releasing ordnance at very low altitude so bombs would skip across the sea like stones and strike ships at the waterline, where armor was weakest. The idea was sound. Making it work was hard. B-17s had no forward-firing armament. Attacking at mast height meant flying through intense AA fire with nothing to silence the gunners. Then Kenny found Paul Gun and everything shifted. In August 1942, Kenny learned someone in the third attack. The group was illegally modifying a DH-20 Havoc light bomber. The alterations were crude but effective. The bombardier's glazed nose had been removed and replaced with .50 caliber guns, all aimed forward to strafe enemy positions at hair-raising low altitude, suppressing ground fire before bombs were dropped. Kenny investigated and discovered Captain Paul Gun essentially working alone, salvaging weapons from wrecked fighters and fitting them into attack planes. Gun had taught himself aircraft modification through hands-on trial and error. He lacked a formal engineering degree, but understood airframe structures, weight balance, and weapon systems from decades of experience. Most officers would have court-martialed him for unauthorized alterations. Instead, Kenny placed him on his personal staff as a special projects officer and set him an urgent task: convert every A-20 in the theater for low-level attack. Gun labored 8-hour days, scavenging guns from crashed planes, fabricating mounts in makeshift shops, and personally test-flying each conversion. He added 4.50 caliber machine guns to the nose of each A-20, mounted extra guns along the fuselage, and fitted bomb racks for parachute fragmentation bombs. The modified A-20s entered combat in September 1942 against an airfield at Buna and produced results beyond expectation. The strafing A-20s came in at treetop height with guns blazing, suppressing AA positions before releasing bombs. Japanese defenders, conditioned to spot high-altitude raids minutes in advance, had no time to respond. The strike destroyed dozens of aircraft on the ground and proved low-level strafing could upend air warfare. Kenny immediately ordered Gun to begin adapting the concept for B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. The B-25s were larger, had greater range, carried heavier bomb loads, and could accommodate more forward-firing weapons. If Gun could convert the Mitchell into a gunship, it would become the theater's most lethal anti-shipping weapon. The B-25 Mitchell, introduced in 1939 as a medium-altitude level bomber, was a twin-engine airplane with a 67 feet 7 in wingspan, powered by two R2-600 radial engines, rated at about 1,700 horsepower each. Its stock armament was mainly defensive, 6.50 caliber machine guns, and it could carry up to 3,000 pounds of bombs with a 5-man crew. Pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio operator, and gunner, named for General Billy Mitchell, the outspoken advocate of air power who had been court-martialed in 1925. Nearly 9,890 B-25s were built at North American plants in Inglewood, California, and Kansas City, Kansas. The Mitchell won fame in April 1942 when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle launched 16 B-25Bs from USS Hornet in a daring raid on Tokyo. The physical damage was limited, but the raid delivered a huge morale boost and forced Japan to keep fighters at home to defend the mainland. Yet the B-25's main role remained medium-altitude bombing, a job at which it was proving ineffective against ships. Gun, however, saw possibilities others missed. The Mitchell's roomy nose could accept several heavy guns. Its twin engines offered redundancy, so losing one need not be fatal, and its rugged build could take punishment. Crucially, its range reached shipping lanes. The shorter-ranged A-20 could not. Late in 1942, Gun started altering B-25s in a Townsville, Australia maintenance hangar with Captain Jack Fox, the North American aviation representative in theater. Fox, officially charged with ensuring factory-correct modifications, instead became Gun's collaborator in what would be the war's most successful unauthorized upgrade. The first step removed the bombardier and his glazed nose, cutting weight and eliminating a useless vulnerability for low-level attack. Gun fitted a solid metal nose packed with .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, all aimed forward and controlled by the pilot. Each gun carried about 500 rounds and fired at roughly 850 rounds per minute, allowing a torrent of fire that could shred most targets within seconds. For guns didn't satisfy Gun, he added 2 more in-cheek fairings on either side of the forward fuselage, positioned so rounds cleared the propeller arc and remained fixed, forward-firing weapons. Then he made a bold change. The B-25's dorsal turret, with its twin .50 seconds mounted behind the cockpit. It was locked facing forward and integrated into the pilot's firing controls. The co-pilot could aim those guns from his station, or the pilot could fire everything together with a master trigger. The result was 8 forward-firing .50 caliber guns, discharging roughly 180 pounds of metal per second. In effect, the modified Mitchell combined the frontal firepower of more than one fighter with the ability to haul a 2,000-pound bomb load. Engineering problems were significant. Nose weight moved the center of gravity forward, making the airplane nose-heavy and harder to handle. Gun compensated by relocating gear aft and adding ballast in the tail. The simultaneous recoil of 8 guns put new stresses on structure, so he reinforced the nose with extra bracing. Heat and smoke from sustained fire required added ventilation and safer ammo storage to reduce fire risk. Most crucially, the guns had to be harmonized so their trajectories converged at a set point ahead of the aircraft, typically 200 to 400 yards, or rounds would scatter uselessly. Gun devised ground tests with measured targets, tweaking mounts until all 8 weapons struck the same point. He test-fired each installation himself and refused to clear any aircraft that failed to meet his standards. Working around the clock, the conversion took about 2 weeks per plane. He taught maintenance crews production line methods to speed the process. By December 1942, he had altered enough B-25s to outfit the 91st Bombardment Squadron. Kenny needed a commander who understood low-level tactics and would break with orthodox bombing doctrine. He chose Major Ed Larkin, a pilot who rose rapidly from first lieutenant for aggressive leadership and had proven skill at low-altitude missions. Larkin and Gunn shaped the tactics that would rewrite naval warfare. The modified Mitchells attacked ships at extreme low altitude, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the water, at speeds near 300 miles per hour. At that height and velocity, they were almost impossible for ship gunners to track. The closing rate outpaced manual aiming, and the planes were gone before defenders could compensate. Pilots opened up with all 8 forward guns at roughly 1,000 yards, walking their fire onto the target to sweep decks, silence anti-aircraft crews, shred superstructures, destroy gun mounts, and sow panic. The goal was not simply to sink vessels with bullets, although gunfire could inflict heavy damage. The principal aim was to neutralize defenses and terrify crews so bombs could finish the job. At about 200 to 400 yards, flying at the lowest safe altitude, the pilot released a bomb with a 4 to 5 second delayed fuse. Traveling at 300 miles per hour, the bomb struck the water and skipped, bouncing once or twice before striking the ship at or below the waterline. The delay kept it from detonating on impact so it could penetrate the hull, dip beneath the surface, and then explode. The blast beneath the armor belt took advantage of water's incompressibility to transmit shock efficiently, rupturing keels, fuel tanks, and engine rooms and causing catastrophic structural failure. By the time the bomb detonated, the Mitchell was already past the target and climbing to avoid blast and secondary explosions. The entire run from initial gun bursts to bomb release lasted roughly 10 seconds. Skip bombing itself was not wholly new. The British and some Americans had experimented with the tactic, but pairing it with overwhelming forward firepower was Gunn's innovation. The Strafer nose turned the bomber into its own fighter escort, suppressing defenses before bombs hit. While Gunn worked on conversions, Allied code breaking and signals intelligence monitored Japanese naval movements. Ultra intercepts and Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne Fromell were reading enemy traffic nearly in real time. In late February 1943, Fromell intercepted signals showing a major Japanese convoy assembling at Rabaul on New Britain, bound for the north coast of New Guinea to deliver troops and supplies to forces resisting Allied advances in Papua. The intelligence was detailed. 8 transports carrying roughly 6,900 men of the 51st Division escorted by 8 destroyers, scheduled to leave Rabaul at midnight on February 28, 1943. And reach Leh about 3 days later, a maximum effort reinforcement that, if successful, could significantly bolster Japanese positions and stall Allied momentum. If the convoy failed, Japan would forfeit thousands of battle-hardened troops and likely abandon future large-scale sea reinforcements. General Kenny recognized a chance to trial his altered aircraft and revise tactics against the most consequential target since Pearl Harbor and marshaled every available plane in the theater for a coordinated strike. The force would mix B-17 Flying Fortresses bombing from medium altitude, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters strafing at low level, P-38 Lightning fighters providing escort, and modified B-25 Strafers executing skip bombing runs, the largest multi-aircraft operation the Southwest Pacific had yet seen. Kenny personally briefed squadron leaders on February 28 with one-message orders: find the convoy, strike without mercy, show no quarter, and sink every ship. This was intended as annihilation, not a raid. At midnight on February 28, 1943, the Japanese column left Simpson Harbor at Rabaul under Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura aboard the destroyer Shirayuki. 8 transports, Kyokomaru, Kambaru, Tiomaru, Nojima Aomaru, Tamaru Shinimaru, and Oemaru, steamed together under escort by 8 destroyers: Shirayuki, Asasio, Arasio, Tokitsukaze, Yukazi, Shikinami, and Asagumo, with roughly 100 Zero fighters slated to provide air cover. It was Japan's most concentrated resupply effort for New Guinea. Kimura expected losses, but assumed enough ships would survive to deliver reinforcements. That assumption proved deadly wrong. A B-2 for a Liberator on patrol spotted the convoy that afternoon and radioed its position, course, and composition. Kenny's headquarters immediately put reconnaissance aircraft on station. Weather initially favored the Japanese as two tropical storms rolled through, shrouding the convoy and limiting attack opportunities. The transports made steady but slow progress at about 7 knots, roughly 8 miles per hour, a speed set by the overloaded transports rather than their escorting destroyers, which could have made 20 knots or more. By nightfall on March 1st, the convoy had covered about 90 miles and was roughly halfway to Lake. The worsening weather, welcomed by Kimura because it reduced Allied air activity, also pounded the ships and left troops jammed into ill-ventilated holds, stricken with seasickness. On the morning of March 2nd, the weather cleared enough for Allied reconnaissance to regain visual contact, and at about 1,000 hours, 29 B-17s struck from around 5,000 feet. As expected, high-altitude bombing produced little effect. The fortresses claimed hits, but Japanese records show minimal damage, perhaps a single transport slightly injured, though the attacks forced the convoy to alter course repeatedly and slowed its progress toward Leh through the day. Further B-17 strikes dropped dozens of bombs from various altitudes, provoking frantic ship maneuvers and fighter engagements. Several B-17s were damaged and 3 Japanese fighters were lost, but no transports sank. The high-level raids harassed but did not stop the column. As dusk fell on March 2nd, Kenny knew the decisive blow would come at first light. The modified B-25s were ready. Major Lana had drilled his pilots relentlessly. Crews had rehearsed the profile over a wrecked ship on February 28th in combined formations of B-17s, B-25s, P-38s, and Bowfighter. The skip bombing runs were practiced, strafing noses harmonized, ordnance loaded. The moment of commitment was near. Dawn on March 3rd brought perfect conditions, clear skies, seas, and excellent visibility. Kimura's convoy was about 30 miles from LA, close enough for shore-based anti-aircraft batteries to lend some protection, but still exposed to a concentrated aerial assault. The Allied strike assembled at Cape Ward Hunt on Papua's northern coast, with about 90 aircraft converging on the Japanese column. The attack unfolded in waves from multiple directions beginning around 1,000 hours. B-17s hit first from medium altitude to draw attention and force evasive moves. Then low-level attackers closed in. Bowfighters first, strafing with their cannons and machine guns to suppress shipboard anti-aircraft fire. The destroyers unleashed everything they had, but the closing speed and low altitude made accurate aiming nearly impossible. Then the modified B-25 Strafers cut loose and the slaughter began. B-25s attacked in repeated waves throughout the morning. One pilot picked the transport Kyokus Maru, plunged to about 50 feet above the sea, and at roughly 1,000 yards opened up. The 8.50 caliber guns firing about 850 rounds per minute each, for a combined rate near 6,800 rounds per minute and delivering roughly 180 pounds of projectiles per second, raked the transport. Tracer streams showed the fire's path as it walked from the bow into the superstructure, tearing gun positions apart, felling men on deck, and shredding the bridge. Then the pilot released 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs with delayed fuses. They struck the water about 200 yards out, skipped once, and punched into the hull at or below the waterline before detonating. Massive underwater blasts tore out the ship's bottom, flooded engine rooms and holds, and she began to founder, settling fast and sinking within minutes. Other B-25s followed the same lethal routine, each picking a vessel and repeating the synchronized strafing and skip bombing profile. The transport Kembaru took multiple strikes from several combined gunfire, slaughtered deck crews, and 4 bombs detonated below the waterline, breaking the ship in two and sending it down in under 10 minutes. Tia Maru was burned out by strafing, and 2 bombs ruptured her hull. She sank with nearly 1,000 troops still aboard. Nojima, unable to evade, was raked from stern to bow and struck in the engine room by bombs, losing power and later sinking. The escorts were not spared. Sailors on the flagship Shirayuki, including Admiral Kimura, suffered catastrophic casualties when strafing fire devastated the bridge and a bomb near the stern ignited a magazine that blew the aft section away. The destroyer went under. Tokitsukaze took direct bomb hits that ignited fuel and turned the ship into an inferno before she sank within the hour. Arashio collided with the transport Nojima, while maneuvering, was heavily damaged, abandoned, and later lost. Japanese Zero fighters tried frantically to intervene, but P-38s engaged them at higher altitude, while the B-25s operated at masthead level were attacking. Fighters risked striking their own ships. The coordination of Allied elements was near perfect. The main phase of the assault lasted roughly 40 minutes, and when Allied planes broke off to rearm and refuel, the scene was apocalyptic, for transports burning or sunk. 3 destroyers gone, the survivors scattered and badly damaged. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors struggling in the water amid burning oil and wreckage. Allied aircraft returned that afternoon for follow-up strikes, finding limp survivors attempting to reach Leh and methodically finishing what the morning had begun. Strafer B-25s came in low, guns roaring, and bombs skipping. More transports went down, and the already damaged destroyer, Asasio, took additional hits and sank. By nightfall, on March 3rd, all 8 transports and 4 of the 8 destroyers had been lost. An estimated 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed or left drowning. Roughly 2,700 were later rescued by the 4 surviving destroyers and by submarines dispatched from Rabaul. Only about 1,200 of the troops eventually reached Leyte, many arriving without weapons or proper equipment. Of the roughly 6,900 men who had embarked, more than 5,700 became casualties. The convoy was effectively wiped out. Allied losses were comparatively light. 1 B-17 was shot down. 3 P-38s were lost in combat, and 13 aircrew were killed. Against the scale of Japanese losses, it was scarcely a contest. The engagement, later called the Battle of the Bismar Sea, proved decisive in the Pacific campaign. It showed beyond doubt that land-based air power could annihilate a heavily escorted naval convoy, that skip bombing paired with overwhelming forward firepower worked, and that every unauthorized alteration gun had made to the Mitchells was tactically sound. Above all, it convinced Japanese commanders that large-scale seaborne reinforcements to the southwest Pacific were too risky to attempt again. Their garrisons would now wither as supplies dried up. General MacArthur's communique wildly inflated the outcome, claiming 22 ships sunk, including 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers, and more than 12,000 troops killed, typical wartime exaggeration. Yet the real losses were still ruinous and the strategic impact undeniable. Watching from Australia, Gunn must have felt a grim satisfaction. His field modifications had destroyed a convoy and cost thousands of enemy lives. Still, his wife and children remained interned at Santo Tomas, and the war was far from finished. The battle's success triggered an immediate expansion of the conversion program. Kenny ordered all available B-25s in the theater refitted as Strafer. Gunn worked longer hours, trained more crews, refined techniques, and by mid-1943, most Mitchells in the Southwest Pacific carried his changes. North American Aviation sent representatives to inspect the field conversions and requested specifications to build factory Strafer versions. Gunn was promoted to major and sent to the United States to collaborate with engineers at the Inglewood and Kansas City plants. That collaboration produced the B-25G, which mounted a 75mm cannon in the nose, alongside 4.50 caliber machine guns. 405G models were produced. The 75mm fired a 14.7-pound shell capable of penetrating, ship plating, or demolishing fortified positions. But it was awkward to load, required a crewman in the nose, and had a slow rate of fire. Gunn personally tested the G in combat, leading a sortie that struck a destroyer's fire control system and blinded its ability to coordinate defenses. Conventional bombs later finished the ship. He publicly claimed the cannon had sunk the vessel, while privately acknowledging the bombs delivered the final blow. The B-25H followed, with roughly 1,000 H variants fitted with the 75mm gun and numerous 50 caliber mounts arranged around the nose and fuselage. The H moved the dorsal turret forward and often dispensed with the co-pilot stationed to save weight, assigning the navigator to assist with cannon handling. The added firepower exacted a price. The H was nose-heavy and harder to fly, and Wrightfield warned the modification created dangerous center of gravity issues. Legend has it, Gunn replied to the warning by saying, "To put center of gravity in storage, we have a war to fight, whether apocryphal or not." The remark captured his attitude that combat effectiveness trumped engineering niceties and crews learned to compensate. The final mainstream variant, the B-25J, returned some aircraft to a conventional bombardier nose while retaining Strafer noses on others. With 4,318 J models built, it became the most numerous B-25. Some J series, Mitchells carried as many as 18.50 caliber machine guns across nose, cheek, turret, and waist positions, making them among the most heavily armed bombers of World War II, and turning their approaching roar into a sound Japanese troops learned to dread. Across 1943 and 1944, the modified Mitchells pummeled Japanese targets throughout the theater. In August 1943, Strafer struck the Wewak airfields and destroyed about 174 aircraft on the ground, shattering Japanese air power in that sector. To reach distant targets, Gunn devised a crude but effective auxiliary fuel system, using tanks in the bomb bay that could be jettisoned through an opening in the floor once empty. A fumes-filled workaround that nonetheless extended range by several hundred miles and made raids like Wewak possible. In November 1943, B-25 Strafers executed a spectacular harbor attack on Rabaul. Major Raymond Jock Hinterberry led 38 Mitchells and Mastahite runs with P-38s covering above and phosphorus bombs laying smoke. 30 out of 38 ships were hit, including a heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and numerous transports, paralyzing Rabaul as a forward base. During the Philippines campaign of 1944, B-25 Strafers provided close air support, severed Japanese supply lines, and attacked shipping across the islands. Crews nicknamed the aircraft the Bat Out of Hell, Because their strikes arrived so fast and so low, defenders scarcely had time to react. Guns modified B-25s were not the only instrument of Allied victory, but they were among the most effective. They sank hundreds of vessels, wrecked thousands of aircraft on the ground, and killed tens of thousands of enemy troops, enabling MacArthur's island-hopping strategy by isolating garrisons from reinforcement. Gun's private war continued while he served. His family remained at Santo Tomas. Sporadic Red Cross letters reached him under censorship, and each carried news of worsening conditions as Japanese discipline hardened. Food dwindled and disease spread. He could do nothing but press on, hoping every mission shortened the war. In late 1944, at 45, Gun was flying over Leyte. A Japanese night bombing of Tacloban airfield inflicted severe wounds when white phosphorus fragments tore into his shoulder, destroying tissue and nerve, and leaving his right arm crippled. Evacuated to Australia, he spent months recuperating, and his combat flying days were over. On February 3, 1945, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division liberated the Santo Tomas internment camp amid Manila's brutal street fighting, arriving as Japanese guards prepared to execute the camp's leaders. More than 4,000 internees were freed, including Polly and the gun children, who had survived 3 years and 14 days behind barbed wire. Emaciated and scarred by trauma, they were nonetheless alive. General MacArthur visited, arranged transport to Australia, and weeks later Paul Gun was reunited with the family he had not seen since Christmas Eve 1941. They were together again, but none of them were unchanged by what they had endured. After recovering from his wounds, Gun stayed in the Army Air Forces, receiving a promotion to lieutenant colonel while focusing on aircraft modifications and tactical innovation. Though he no longer flew combat missions, he officially retired on June 30, 1948. As a full colonel due to medical reasons related to his injuries. His awards included the Distinguished Flying Cross with 1 Oak Leaf Cluster, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, 9 Purple Hearts, 4 separate combat wounds, and numerous unit citations and campaign ribbons. After leaving the service, Gun returned to the Philippines and helped rebuild Philippine Airlines, reconnecting islands that had been cut off by war and occupation. He continued flying and taking risks until October 11, 1957. Just a week before his 58th birthday, when his charter plane crashed during a storm, ending his life. He was laid to rest at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida, where he had once taught flight. His legacy endured through the B-25 Strafer modifications he pioneered, which became standard during the war. Thousands of Mitchells were converted following his designs, and the skip bombing technique he perfected destroyed hundreds of Japanese ships, playing a critical role in Allied victory. Gun had shown that innovation could arise from necessity and personal determination. Even within a rigid military bureaucracy, the Battle of the Bismar Sea became a classic case study in military strategy, demonstrating how intelligence, coordination, novel weapons, and new tactics could achieve decisive victory at minimal cost. Each ship sunk represented countless enemy missions denied, lives eliminated, and ammunition wasted before reaching the battlefield, proving that attacking supply lines was one of the most efficient forms of warfare. The modified B-25 became the tool that made this possible, able to seek out ships, suppress defenses with concentrated firepower, deliver skip bomb attacks, and return to base for repeated missions. Japan learned the lesson too late. After the disaster at the Bismar Sea, they avoided large daytime convoys, shifted critical supplies to submarines, and relied increasingly on coastal barges, all still vulnerable to B-25 Strafers, which hunted ships and barges with precision using radar-equipped night operations. Month by month, Japanese garrisons were isolated, fighting bravely but with dwindling supplies, their courage rendered irrelevant by Allied air superiority. By 1945, the B-25 Strafer had become the Pacific's standard anti-shipping aircraft, evolving through the GH and J variants, each increasing in firepower while retaining Gun's original concept, a medium bomber transformed into a gun platform capable of suppressing defenses and striking with devastating effect at low altitude. When the war ended in August 1945, modified B-25s were still in action, including escorting the Japanese surrender delegation to Manila, a fitting tribute to the aircraft that had so decisively weakened Japan. Post-war assessments by American and Japanese historians confirmed the importance of Gun's modifications. Japanese naval officers acknowledged they could no longer operate safely within range of Allied air bases. The psychological impact of low-flying, heavily armed bombers was as significant as the physical destruction, creating a new form of naval warfare where medium bombers struck with submarine-like efficiency and cruiser-level firepower. Lessons from skip bombing and forward-firing armament influenced post-war air forces worldwide, inspiring gunship designs like the AC-47, AC-119, and AC-130 used decades later. Of nearly 9,900 B-25s built, more than 100 survive today, many in flying condition. appearing at airshows where the roar of their Art 2600 engines evokes the fear they once struck into Japanese sailors. Museums such as the National Museum of the United States Air Force, the National Naval Aviation Museum, and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum preserve B-25s, telling stories of innovation, desperation, and victory. General George Kenney documented Gun's story in a 1959 biography, highlighting his unauthorized modifications, combat missions, and personal struggle to free his family. Gun's youngest son Nathaniel also wrote accounts from the family perspective, showing the human cost of war and endurance required. In 1975, the U.S. Air Force posthumously honored Gun by naming a training facility after him. Gun had never sought fame, he sought results. His refusal to accept his family's imprisonment, the limitations of existing weapons, and regulations that hindered innovation led to a transformative weapon. The modified B-25 destroyed hundreds of Japanese ships, killed thousands of enemy troops, enabled Allied strategic advances, and directly contributed to shortening the war. It exemplified how necessity, personal drive, technical skill, and supportive leadership could create extraordinary results. Born in a maintenance hangar from desperation, flown at treetop level with guns blazing and bombs skipping across the water to explode beneath hulls, the B-25 Strafer crushed Japanese supply lines, saved Allied lives, and ultimately reunited a family after 3 long years of imprisonment, achieving the very purpose that had inspired